Hello, this is Patricia Martin, and welcome to Jung in the World, a podcast of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Today, we're going to dive into one of Carl Jung's most enduring theories, and that's the concept of synchronicity. Carl Jung began writing about this in about 1928, and it's a big concept because it has scientific roots, but it also has more ethereal roots, metaphysical, if you will. Let me give you the definition of it so that you can follow along. Synchronicity happens when two or more events occur in a way that has a personal significance, but these things arise without any cause and effect. So imagine that you're thinking about an old friend you haven't been in touch with for years. They come to mind. Suddenly your phone lights up, and it's that person. These two events have these two concepts, these two moments, they have a connection to each other that is unique and meaningful to you. And so today we're going to talk about the science and the enchantment of synchronicity. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're talking with Dan Ross, a Jungian analyst on the faculty here at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Dan has done hospice work for over 30 years. As a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, he brings both medical and psychiatric experience to the field of end-of-life care. As a Jungian analyst, Dan also works in private practice here in Chicago. Today, Dan's joining us to discuss one of Carl Jung's most enduring ideas, the theory of synchronicity. Dan, welcome back to Jung in the World.
Thank you, Patricia. It's wonderful to be here.
Thanks. I want to dive in here to the theory of synchronicity, which I understand you're going to be in Zurich talking about, because you've done so much thought and work on this. Acknowledging that there are many experts on this, but you have come to it with sort of a fresh curiosity, which I noticed in you tend to do. So, Dan, I wonder if we could just zero in on what you would consider a good definition of synchronicity.
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. I think my study of it brought me to, I think, what's a good interpretation of Jung's definition from his essay on synchronicity. And it's three components, or three different versions of synchronistic events. The first one, each pair of synchronistic events includes an internally conceived and externally perceived component. Number two, any presumption of a direct causal relationship between the events is absurd or even inconceivable. And number three, the events correspond with one another by a common meaning, often expressed symbolically.
Okay, so that last point, that
Yes.
third point, I need you to say a few more words about that, because that's a big idea. This has been my experience in thinking through Carl Jung's work, whenever we get into words like archetype or symbol, those are big concepts.
Yes.
Could you repeat number three?
I will. Let me first, absolutely. Let me say the source of this. It's from Atmanspacher, who's written extensively on this and has two books on this subject that he's worked with two different other people. But and this is kind of the latest version of it. But the last thing I think is the most important.
Right.
The struggle I had with writing about Rose and my experiences, I kept asking myself, are these synchronistic, or are these just meaningful experiences for me?
Right.
And I had to compare the available information around that. And I think and I think Atmanspacher is speaking for Jung in his interpretation of what Jung wrote on the subject, that these events, like we go back to my patient with the homeless person in left field of a baseball park, that there's the events are corresponding. In other words, the event of the dream the internal structure of the patient's relationship to the father, and the transference with me, and the phone call by the physician to me interrupting our session. All those events correspond to each other in not in acausal ways, but the correspondence has meaning. Each event carries a meaning that, when everything is put together, has a shared meaning. And I think that's what Abisbacher is stressing here. So that helped me appreciate that the experiences I had with Rose were made meaningful by virtue of all of them together and happening at the same time with no causality involved.
It's sort of like in the Matrix, right? Yep. When they see the cat,
Yeah.
and they
Yeah,
say,
yeah,
it's a glitch in the Matrix,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
we understand
Yeah. Yeah.
somehow collectively that
Yeah.
these things happen.
Yeah.
They're acausal.
Yeah.
We can't explain them, but we sense their meaning. Like,
They're meaningful. Yes.
they're
Yes.
meaningful
Yes.
to us.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we have an affective experience around that. We may have other experiences that are meaningful, and we don't have to call those synchronistic. But what he's saying here, and I think he thinks Jung is saying, is it's the meaning that, and Jung started out talking about synchronicity as being numinous.
Yes.
And later on, he kind of let go of that and say, well, these experiences are probably more prevalent than I originally had given them credit for,
Well, I
which is
think,
important.
yes, I think it's important. So the numinous means, arising from the unknown, from
Yes.
from the divine, even.
Yes.
Right?
And has an effect on the subject as being awe-inspiring,
Yes.
right? That's the part of it. That's the numinous part that I wanted to stress, that the subject has a particular experience around this that perhaps nobody else can get, right?
Yeah, it does seem sometimes that these moments are uniquely packaged for you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I think the other thing is that it's a moment when you're taken by surprise.
Yes.
And in my experience, when I touch material that is arising for me to consider, that takes me by surprise,
Yes.
it's usually coming from my unconscious. There's
Yes.
there's something that's being released from the unconscious that is being met with the outside world.
Yes.
And now I'm aware.
Yes.
Now
Yes.
I'm saying, this is surprising. I did not
Yeah.
expect this. What
Yeah.
does this have to say to me?
Yes.
Right? And then
Yeah.
we get to your ideas, Dan, about, well, if you're open to
Yes.
considering that,
Yeah.
that this channel of communication is now,
Yeah.
it's a highway, and you can
Yeah.
get traffic on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope I'm not oversimplifying your thinking.
Oh, no. I think it's, most of my practice right now, I just reached this place where people are so caught in the causal way of worldview that they aren't open to these events that would help enhance their life and bring a sense of the divine and relationship with the divine in their lives, which I think most people are missing, right? And so my work is in really trying to open them up to the possibility that there is other experience out there that has nothing to do with causality, nothing to do with reason. The theme in Zurich, and you could tell the theme because it's in almost every title of every presentation, is that the non-understandable. That's basically the theme, the non-understandable.
Believing in things we cannot understand.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
And Jung talks about that in the Red Book. It's part of his dialogue, his active imaginations, that what he's getting to in terms of what he eventually calls magic is not understandable. You can't get there through reason.
This is life. And sometimes what makes life worth living are the surprising, unexpected moments.
Yes, yes, yes.
Otherwise, it's
It's
real.
mechanical.
It's
It's
mechanical.
mechanical.
Like,
Yeah,
who wants to
exactly.
live like that,
That's
right?
right.
We're
That's
inventing
right.
robots to do that.
That's right. Yeah. Thinking about the parallel here, because Jung came to this concept late in his career. It was his last couple of decades in which he was working with Wolfgang Pauli, a scientist, a physicist, a Nobel physicist, who he had treated or was treated in analytical psychology for his own personal breakdown. Jung used his dreams for teaching purposes in a series of lectures. But the relationship after that work with Pauli became very important to him shaping his idea of synchronicity, which some have said he might not have had the courage to do without that relationship with Pauli, because it gave him a kind of a scientific basis and a scientific icon in the field to be able to take this idea seriously. And of course, Pauli took synchronicity seriously as well, even if he came at it from a more scientific perspective, as Jung from a more clinical perspective. But so the parallel I'm talking about is I came to synchronicity late. I ignored all the training. Poor George Hoganson, who did wonderful training throughout my training years to become an analyst. Um, I would say, oh yeah, synchronicity, yeah, it's great. I'm more interested in the nature of the psyche, the shadow, the anima, the components, that kind of stuff. But it was more, I think, the past couple of years where this idea of synchronicity became more important. And as I look back on my career, even before therapy, when I was a nurse, when I was working in hospice, what I realized was that the synchronicities, which Jung called meaningful coincidences, amongst other things that he called it, um, the synchronicities I experienced at end of life over decades of working in hospice um, had an effect on me that I'm beginning to realize had to do with what Roderick Mayne calls enchantment.
Mm.
So Roderick Mayne's latest, actually, his two books, but the latest one in particular, uh, the Breaking the Spell of Disenchantment is his latest book. It came out, I think, last year. Um, says that synchronicities are a way to enchantment. And of course, we live in an age of disenchantment after science entered the consciousness. And I think we're catching up with that. But for me, I had to go back to my CTP training, which was called CTP, is now called JPP. Because during that training, I worked with a woman who was dying of cancer, and I had the privilege of working with her for 2.5 years before she died. And in that work, this was way before I became an analyst, the experiences that we had together compelled me to become a Jungian analyst, and I would spend the next several years on that pathway. So what I needed to do is go back to understand those experiences from a more critical point of view, meaning I was taking the available theories that have been written about in analytical psychology over the last 30 years, including George Hoganson and Joe Cambray, Gene Knox, and more recently, Altmitzbacher, who's speaking in Zurich, by the way, who's more a scientist, and taking that theory and applying it to my experience.
I want to talk about that.
Okay.
And I'm very interested in diving into some of what you've witnessed in end of life care and
Yes.
synchronicity, but I want to get into this scientific question because yes, I think I would agree with you that Carl Jung was somehow empowered by a serious scientist delving into this with him,
Yes.
because it created some guardrails and some, to an energy. It's really in reading, examples from memories, dreams, reflections. There is a feeling that these synchronous moments, I guess I would say, are unbounded. They're
Mm.
energy,
Yes.
and they contain something in them that, enchantment would be a good word for it, because it's very hard to pin down.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And I think Jung referred to it several times as being acausal. And
Yes, he did.
science doesn't like that.
No.
Science likes causality,
Yes.
which is very hard to prove. And so you spend your time proving the cause of something, the cause and effect, sometimes to the abnegation of a more whole understanding of what the phenomena is. And so
Yes.
I think this is again where I look at the work of Carl Jung, that he was
Yes.
willing to go in and try to explain and define, as an analyst and also as a scientist, these very difficult metaphysical phenomena.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, and so let's go into this experience first of all that you may have had, that, and perhaps it was with your cancer patient. Um, that was the moment that synchronicity showed itself, and it was epiphanal.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
You knew something was up, and you knew this was
Yeah. Yeah. The fact that this patient came to me out of just, I had a physician that was medical director of a nursing home who was a friend of mine who said, "We have this patient. She has cancer, and she's causing a lot of trouble at the nursing home. And the director of nursing is thinking about calling the state to report elder abuse on her because she keeps yelling at her husband." That's how this patient was presented to me, and she said, "Would you talk to her?" Uh, and I did. And that just began a long-term relationship. Coincidentally, I was beginning the JPP program, which back then was not separated between psychotherapy and studies. It was all one program. Um, and I went in as a nurse with hospice experience, but no real psychotherapeutic experience. So I was like initiating into psychotherapy and the whole analytical psychology thing all at the same time. But what it provided me, the program provided me with the conceptual understanding and teaching around analytical psychology, as you experienced. Um, at the same time, experiencing my working with this woman and seeing this woman every week for 2.5 years. And I'll just give you one example of a synchronicity that came at the end. Um, of our work together. Um, she, the last 3 months, I was seeing her before she died. My mother who had advanced Alzheimer's disease, started to worsen and required nursing home placement, and I orchestrated that. And got her set up, and then was managing her care through the director of nursing in the nursing home. And I was overseeing that. I was seeing her weekly. So coincidentally, I was seeing her weekly. I was seeing Rose weekly, and it was now this parallel thing going on. Um, and then I saw Rose one day, and then my mother had aspirated and taken a turn for the worse. So I then went there and began initiating hospice care. Um, as I got my family together to sit around at my mother's bedside as she was dying, At some point, I get a phone call, and I didn't know who was calling. I didn't There was no names. In those days, there was no names attached to the phone number, and I didn't recognize the number. Anyway, I knew it was about Rose. I don't know how I knew that. Anyway, I went out to the hall to take the call. The social worker called me and said that Rose had just died, and she knew how important, she was to me, and I appreciated it. And just as, I was about to end the call, my wife comes out to tell me, gesture to me that my mother was near the end. I went back in, and within a minute, my mother stopped breathing and died.
Oh.
And that synchronicity to me, uh, I think its meaning didn't come clear till many years later in my analytic work. Um, but at least initially, the coincidence of that brought those two relationships together in a very meaningful way, um, because they were because my experience with Rose was meaningful on the level of having, I think my analyst at the time suggested I had 2 mothers. I had a biological mother who was dying, and I had a spiritual mother who
Mm.
was dying, and they died at the same time. And that really became the launch of my analytic career, basically, from that point forward.
So I'm curious about how you work with analysans when they come to you with a story that, clearly it's a moment of synchronicity that they're describing, or
Yes.
they've witnessed something that is symbolic and they might not recognize it as a symbol that is
Yes.
sending a message to them. How do you unpack that with someone in your care?
Well, let's separate that from synchronicity. Synchronicity is something that comes um, out of what Jung would call the psychoid, um, but and it has an archetypal foundation to it. So it's like the energy around the archetype, I think Jung would describe, um, comes in, and at a particular time that's completely unpredictable and unexpected, and as you said, acausal. Um, that's that's different. That can't be orchestrated by anybody, right? But the work that you're suggesting, working with dreams and stuff like that, is the kind of the work of analytical work, right?
Mhm.
Um, I'll give you an example of something synchronistic. When a patient comes in with a dream, um, and for this particular patient, the dreamer had a particular relationship with his father that was, very difficult. He couldn't rely on his father, couldn't trust his father, and so forth. And the dream was that a homeless man was out on a baseball field in left field, and he had all his possessions around him on this baseball field. And the dream image kinda stuck with us, and we kinda worked with it, as an example of my patient's experience of his father leaving him homeless. In other words, whatever didn't happen between him and his father, whatever developmental need was not met, it left him feeling homeless, right? Um, in that session talking about their dream and their dream image, I get a phone call from my doctor, and I felt the need to take it in the middle of the session. And I told him that I needed to take this call. I apologize and so forth. I took the call, uh, and it was brief. It was setting up an appointment for surgery. And so I get back on to talk about the patient. We kind of went out with the session. And so the next session, the patient brought up the fear that he had that he was going to lose me, and that it brought up the whole experience of his father, that he carried the fantasy that he had not yet repaired his relationship with his father, and the fear that his father might die before that takes place. And then I went back to the dream image, and I says, "It's as if the dream image came out of left field, which is a metaphor for synchronicity.
Mm,
You see?
yes.
So
Makes sense.
the synchronicity is what was going on. This is Jung's typical definition. Something was on the that was going on the inside came out on the outside. For us, me and my analysis, it was the synchronistic moment of the phone call from the doctor that brought into focus the nature of his relationship to his father and reflected the nature of his relationship to me as well in that moment.
Yes, there's some transference there going on. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That was had been there, but now was helped to be clarified by that unexpected event that I couldn't have anticipated, you know, and certainly couldn't orchestrate. But it's being able, George Bright, who you've interviewed,
Mhm.
um, wrote a seminal paper in 1997 called Synchronicity and the Analytic Attitude. Um, and he would say in that paper that the what goes on between the analyst and the analysand creates the opportunity. And if the analyst has the right attitude, then those synchronicities are possible to occur. Does
So,
that make sense?
well, it does, but it does call up some questions for me. What would be the proper attitude that would make it possible, that would open the field, as it were,
Yeah.
for synchronicities to arrive?
Well, I think several things. The first thing is you refer to is the acausality. So one has to, analyst has to be out of the causal uh, drinking of the Kool-Aid of the collective, which is we're all raised in the mode of thinking that is causal, that's cause and effect. Um, and one has to get out of that to realize um, that experience and much experience is not causal at all. That is that has its own need or volition or uh, energy and existence, and such as their dream and their dream image and the phone call with the doctor. It just has um, its own meaning and purpose. I think that's why Jung became very interested in Eastern religions and Chinese, the I Ching, because it was not causal. It's not based on the scientific principle. It was based on events happen that have a correspondence to each other, like the I Ching. It's the it's built around the idea that multiple events can happen simply by virtue that they have a connection to each other and they happen at the same time, and it has nothing to do with cause and effect.
Yeah, I was out in Taos last year, and I stayed at the place where Carl Jung had stayed,
Mm,
and he sought access to a tribe. Um,
mm,
and that particular tribe, that land was hotly contested because it not only sits, at the base of the Taos Mountain,
mhm,
but as you go up and into the mountain, there it opens into what looks like a paradise. I've only
mm,
seen pictures
mhm.
because there's a lake.
Yeah.
Lakes out in the Southwest don't come along every day,
Ah,
and it was
yeah.
believed that the lake was sacred, and so there were
Yeah.
many rituals
Yes.
and tribal beliefs around the sanctity of that lake. And so
Yes.
Carl Jung was eager to have access to some of the tribal leaders to have a conversation about this. And what's curious about it, and I think what's curious about synchronicity, is that it attracts scientific minds, because everyone has pretty much had these acausal
Yes. Yes.
experiences. Like, how do you explain these?
Yes.
Then on the spiritual side, there has to be a curiosity about it
Absolutely.
because
Yeah.
otherwise it doesn't make logical sense. It's
Yeah.
arriving from a, that train is coming in from a very different station,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
know, if I could
Absolutely.
use that metaphor.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think I'm curious about that, how much you would say Carl Jung sort of tried to penetrate an equal amount of science and an equal amount of spiritual discovery around what became his theory of synchronicity. Was it?
Question.
Yeah.
It's really a mystery. George Bright and I talk about this because when we work with the Red Book, um, it's what Jung is living there and constructing there is really a relationship to the divine in a way that has synchronicity as a component of it. He doesn't use that word. He doesn't use any psychological language in the Red Book, but the foundation for it is there. It permeates the Red Book. Um, but uh, both of us wonder about this idea that Jung had of after the Red Book. It was so mysterious. How did he go from the Red Book then to developing his more exoteric ideas and theories and nomenclature? And that we're still figuring out. Diane Hurst, who we've had on a podcast or a seminar recently, who works with George Bright at the institute, put out a book recently called "The Enchanting of the Unconscious," and she came up with a brilliant research, involved research between that goes from Jung in London between 1919 and 1921, I think it is, um, which helps us understand bridging Jung moving from his very powerful images and this confrontation with the unconscious, as he calls it,
Mhm.
1913, 1914, to trying to make a science bring science out of it and his version of science to develop the nature of the psyche, the structure of the psyche, um, and developing some nomenclature and conceptualization about what his experience was in the Red Book. Um, and he spent the next decades. He said he spent, all of my work really is based on those that experience confrontation with the unconscious, those the year or 2 years. And the mystery is that for me, I'm sure not for a lot of people, and for George, the Red Book was much clearer about the experience that we're talking about and analytic experience. Um, and that the exoteric interpretation of his experience, which came in the 20 volumes that have come out, um, had its was problematic. It was all we had, and it was useful. But if you compare his original experience and how he laid it out, and really study it, um, it, it leaves his other work left to some interpretation, if that makes sense. So I guess to answer your question, it's really a mystery why Jung felt so compelled to bring a scientific interpretation to his rather esoteric experience. Um, and maybe to do that, that was the only way he's going to be appreciated by the analytic community, by the scientific community, which I think was important to him. Um, and that's parallel to why did I need to study synchronicity in such depth the last couple of years, given the available abundant literature on it right now, to go back to my experience with Rose, my patient that I was with for 2 years, to go back to that, to try and understand it in a more scientific way. You see what I'm saying?
Yes,
I
I
mean, I
do.
had the experience, but now I needed, for some reason, to go back to be able to describe it, talk about it, and provide some scientific or rational foundation for it, I
Yeah, because
guess.
otherwise it's very hard to explain to someone.
It is.
And I think we want to be understood, and I think that Carl Jung was probably no different. But I also, again, I'm reminded often the work that Jung and Freud had before them, which was to define a new science,
Yes.
which meant
Yes. Yes.
nomenclature and phenomena that had some scientific uh, explanation to them
Yes.
because the science didn't exist.
Yes.
And so I wonder also, Dan, when you study synchronicity and then experience it, the more you've studied it, does it change your experience?
Yes. Yes. I'm glad you said that. Because in my paper, I point out the fact, and others have too, that when you're studying synchronicity, interestingly, you have more synchronistic experiences.
I'm going to say
Like
that's
the
a little
experience with
spooky.
the it is spooky. Well, and it suggests, it goes back to your question, what kind of attitude is needed?
Ah,
Well, apparently, I would say that the attitude when you're studying this, it has an effect on one's attitude to make one more open to the recognition of synchronicity. Not that synchronicities aren't abound, right?
mhm.
They happen all the time. The question is, are we open to it? And what do we bring to the table, so to speak? Uh, Clearly, I brought to the rose table a lot of anticipation, a lot of excitement, a lot of analytic um, wonderment, and uh, what new ideas. I mean, it was like I was, this was in my apprenticeship back then, was taking these ideas, which were exciting, and then bringing them to my experience with Rose, and then having all kinds of experiences that changed me. I think changed her too, and changed the whole end of life concept for me. The whole experience of end of life changed at that moment, although I'd been in hospice for 30 years.
I wonder if you could just talk a little bit, Dan, before we wrap up. I'd
Yeah.
I'd like to know, because you've worked for 30 years in hospice care, is there something that you've witnessed that you could say is a pretty common thing where, as we write that last chapter of our lives, do we have more synchronicities occur, or
Yes.
fewer, or and do you think some of that is the unfinished business that we're trying to write that unfinished business of individuation pretty quickly? It's a short story.
Yes. Well, yes. To answer your question, yes. So all of it. And I think, if we look at two analytical psychologists in our history, going all the way back to Jane Wheelwright. She wrote a book on working with a dying patient. Um, and there she came to the conclusion. First of all, it was a very intense experience. It was a very intimate relationship, and it profoundly changed her in the course of her analytic work. But what she said was that she realized that at the end of life, individuation is spurred on, is enhanced, is catalyzed in some way. Now, years later, Joyce Chevrine um, from London, I believe she's from, said the same thing in a book she wrote on the dying patient in psychotherapy. Similar intensity of relationship, but the same conclusion that end of life spurs on the individuation process. Now, the second question is, does it bring on synchronicities? Absolutely. And one of the problems that I've had to deal with particularly over the last few years, was my love and hate relationship with the medical model. Because at the end of life, the medical model's tyranny, I often always believed, interfered with the natural progression of death and the synchronicities that can bring meaning to life of the dying patient or the family or those surrounding. Um, and I think I've come to terms with the fact that I think rather than the medical model's reasoning and tyranny and one-sidedness, that Jung talks about, that it actually contributes to the synchronicities. But it took me a while to get there. But one has to be open to those synchronicities. I'll give you just a brief example in a paper that I wrote 3 years ago for Buenos Aires. And I was working with a patient when I was working palliative care, I was doing palliative care while I was in analytic training and had an analytic practice. So I'd go from my analytic patients to palliative care patients. And the patient I had in palliative care um, was a good example. I only had her about 8 weeks before she died. She had a very progressive, very advanced cancer that was causing her a great deal of suffering. And what happened between us in that eight weeks was so important to her conclusion of her life, which included what? Coming to terms with the fact that her parents basically abandoned her when she was a teenager. Um, she never really had come to terms with that or processed it, but that came into the course of our work in very synchronistic ways, and I was open to that. I had enough analytic um, attitude to be open to that, and it really had an impact on me because before she died, first of all, in peace because she was able to accept hospice after several weeks of resisting it. The oncologist was able to accept hospice after several weeks of resisting it, and everything kind of changed towards the end with a sense that her life was completed. And that was the same experience I had with Rose, that synchronistically and beyond both our control, that something happened to allow her life to feel completed at the end of it.
So, this idea of completion is really quite beautiful, Dan, because what you're saying, if I can say it back to you, is that there's something about the end of life, writing that last chapter, that is
Yes.
propellant.
Yes.
And it moves us through the unfinished business of our individuation and
Yeah.
to completion. And there's
Yes.
something
Yes. Yes.
really
Yes.
gratifying about that.
There's something really gratifying. Yeah. Yeah. Joe Campery in a chapter of a Chiron book that came out last year called, there's a compilation of essays by some great analysts. It's called Confronting Death.
Mhm.
And in his chapter, he actually starts the chapter out with the question, okay, uh, if he basically concludes, and then the rest of the paper is filling that in, that um, that nature, if we're open to it, prepares us for death. Nature prepares us for death. Now, I would say for both the patients that I've talked about at the end of life, it was nature. Now, what is nature? Nature is the psyche's need or desire to heal itself, to come to a finishing process that's beyond our control. That if we're open to it, we can facilitate or at least not get in its way, right?
Mhm.
And uh, I think Joe was right about that. That nature does it. At the same time, in another chapter in that book, John Beebe writes an essay about his thinking about his end of life. And he writes a brilliant essay on how he uses a film to do that. And he amplifies the film and he uses it as his own journey, psychic journey through his end of life, and he uses the anima for that. And the film kind of depicts that as he goes through and explains the film. But those are two. One is nature, we call nature, and the other is, well, we contribute something to that, right? We can, like you said, write your last story. Well, that suggests that the ego is involved in that, and that you're doing something towards the conclusion of your life.
Well, because we're always in the search for meaning.
Yeah.
And it's part of the normal function, I think, of the ego is to seek meaning.
Yes.
Well, why are we here?
Yeah.
What was my life about in the end? And so it just sounds like this is an amalgam of things. One, it's being open. Two, it's being curious.
Yes.
And three, it's being patient and observant to see what nature has to say.
Yeah.
This has been beautiful, Dan. Thank you so much for coming on the show to talk to us about synchronicity.
Thank you. It's been very exciting.
Wish you well, and congratulations on giving a talk in Zurich and break a leg.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian Analyst near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2025 donors who gave at the supporting level and above. Arlo Kampen, Usha and Ashok Bedi, David Dalrymple in honor of Tom Kapasinskas, Peter Demuth, Mary Doherty, Carl Greer, Ken James, David Johnson, Mary Ann Johnson, John Manning in honor of Janine Mellinger, Mona Manning, Boris Matthews, Kenan McKee, Karen Newland, Murray Stein in honor of Lee Roloff, Mary Tice, Florence Tingley, Alexander Wayne, Ellen Young, and the Kapagangula Ramji Charitable Fund. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.